welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. I'm Matthew Weaver and I'm joined by Joe Bond, and today we're going to cover marijuana. Hopefully you can see this screen here, this PowerPoint presentation. Let me know if you don't. I assume you can because it should be shared. Okay, so today's presentation will take roughly 20 to 30 minutes, and here's an agenda of what we're going to be going over. First, we'll start with definitions. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about marijuana? Then we'll get into the national overview. We'll look at federal history as far as legislation goes, and then we'll kind of take a look at the landscape as far as other states and their marijuana policies. Then we'll delve into Montana specifically, our own legislative history as regards marijuana, and then we'll try to simplify what these laws mean in terms of a practical everyday approach to marijuana in Montana. And then we'll look at taxes and revenue. Then we'll wrap things up with some of the major current issues. Not everything. The list could, of course, be quite extensive, so we'll just try to hit the wave tops of things kind of coming down the pipeline here, and then we'll open it up for any questions you might have for either of us. So when we talk about marijuana, what exactly do we mean? I think the best way to think about this is marijuana defined in conjunction with hemp. The point here being that both of these, marijuana and hemp, are the same plant. They're both cannabis, but the difference comes into how we define their level of delta-9 THC concentration. Now, delta-9 THC is the psychoactive element. Note here with hemp, that's differentiated from marijuana, despite the fact that they're the same plant, because its total delta-9 THC concentration is no more than 0.3%. What does this mean? Well, when we're talking about marijuana in terms of Montana statute, it is considered marijuana because its delta-9 THC, its psychoactive concentration, is greater than 0.3%. That's the key differentiation. It's kind of like looking at two people and saying one of them has high blood pressure. How are you going to know? Well, they're both human beings, of course. The difference is to do the test and differentiate what those levels would be. Now, something else to be aware of when we talk about marijuana is synthetic marijuana or synthetic cannabinoids. In Montana law, these are explicitly not the same thing as marijuana. The reason being, synthetic cannabinoids are produced artificially. These are man-made chemicals that are essentially made to mimic what cannabis or THC does, but it is not the same thing. It is, again, artificially made. One of the best examples of this, 10, 15 years ago, spice was a pretty big product. And all this is a man-made chemical made to mimic cannabinoids. Normally, this would be applied to something like a dry, shredded plant material, but it can be applied to anything, to include marijuana itself. It's just a chemical substance added, again, intended to mimic those effects. But even then, it's not quite the same thing. And that's that differentiation. Synthetic cannabinoids, it's kind of like a knockoff product that isn't made of the same material or to the same specifications. It's just something to bear in mind in the issue of marijuana. So the national overview, as far as laws throughout U.S. history go, really don't begin until 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act. Now, this did not outright ban marijuana in the United States, but it levied such extensive regulation and steep penalties that for all intents and purposes, it did ban practical use of cannabis, although called marijuana at the time, cannabis products. Ultimately, this would be found unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1969, but that was swiftly followed by the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. When we think of anything to do with drugs in the United States, it all revolves around this, the Controlled Substances Act. When this explicitly criminalized marijuana, made it illegal in the United States, again, marijuana being cannabis, and that included hemp at the time as well. This also created the schedules of controlled substances. So marijuana was included in Schedule 1. We've got 5 schedules total, Schedule 1 being the most restrictive, down to Schedule 5 being the least restrictive. And we'll cover this a little bit later on. Since 1970, nothing really changed federally. But in 2015, the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment really changed how the federal government approached marijuana in terms of its medicinal qualities. This amendment prohibits the DOJ from using its funds to interfere with state medical marijuana laws. And this has been passed every year since 2015. Now, the next major piece of legislation at the federal level to change the landscape for marijuana was the 2018 Farm Bill. This legalized hemp by giving it its own statutory definition, that being hemp is cannabis containing no more than 0.3% concentration of delta-9 THC. Of course, you can see where this relates to the Montana definition. That's because we get it from the federal definition. This really opened up the landscape in terms of differentiating hemp from marijuana, considering that both are cannabis. Now, since that time, nothing else has happened, but something to be aware of policy-wise is the DOJ's notice for proposed rulemaking. So this year, the DEA announced its plans to reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. So that's from the most restrictive to somewhere in the middle. And they will have a public hearing on this in December of this year. This is not a given quite yet, but it's something to bear in mind, and we'll talk about this later on when we get into the current issues portion. So that's the federal level. Well, what about the rest of the states? So as of late 2024, nearly half of the United States, that's 24 states, have legalized recreational marijuana. Now, when I say recreational marijuana, here in Montana, we also use the term adult use. I'm going to use those interchangeably, but really that's recreational marijuana. And you can see that represented here in black on the map. 4/5 of the United States have legalized some sort of medical marijuana program. Those the states represented in these darker shades of green. If you look at Montana regionally, you'll see that we're a little bit of an outlier here in that we have legalized recreational marijuana. But take note that as of November this year, some of our neighbors will be voting on initiatives to legalize marijuana, being North Dakota, South Dakota. Florida will also be voting on a legalization initiative. And then Nebraska will be voting to legalize medical marijuana this November as well. So we could be seeing this landscape of our neighbors changing relatively soon. So speaking of Montana, what is our history with marijuana legislation? Well, ours goes back to predate 1937, and that is in 1929, Montana prohibited marijuana. Not until 2004 did we see another significant change in Montana's legislation, and that was with Initiative 148 when medical marijuana was legalized. It would take another 16 years between 2004 up to 2020 before we'd seen another significant change, and this was Initiative 190, which legalized recreational or adult use marijuana in Montana. That 16 years in between saw basically a back and forth between increasing regulation and relaxing regulation. There's a lot more to it. Some different bills introduced, some vetoes from the governor, some court cases. But essentially the issue was solved or settled, so to speak, in 2022 with Initiative 190. If you look at this map here of Montana, this more or less is exactly the same in terms of the counties that voted to approve Initiative 190. One significant change is Granite County. Granite County initially voted to permit adult use or recreational sales, but in 2022 reversed course and now prohibits sales in its county. Otherwise, this map really reflects what happened in 2020 up to the current day. There's a number of bills that I've not included in this list, so this is really just the wave tops of the more significant changes in Montana's legislation. A couple more to be aware of is House Bill 701, which gave authority to the Department of Revenue to regulate marijuana in the state and created the Cannabis Control Division. And also 2023 House Bill 948 prohibited synthetic cannabinoids. So this, again, often gets tied into the issue of marijuana, and Montana has prohibited synthetic cannabinoids since 2023. So as far as what Montana's legislation permits here in the state, we've got a list of very simplified terms of what you can expect to see here. And that is Montana provides licenses from the very beginning, so planting seeds up to sale to the purchaser. So cultivating, manufacturing, testing, transporting, and sale. There's a license for each one of those phases in the process. Unchanged since 2004 is our medicinal marijuana program. That's still in effect. But of course, the biggest change here, the most prominent change is adult use or recreational use for those aged 21 and over. Anyone age 21 and over is allowed to possess up to 1 ounce of marijuana. That's roughly the size of a coconut, according to the CCD, and that can be no more than 8 grams in a concentrate form. Those are things like resins or waxes, excuse me, and no more than 800 milligrams of THC in marijuana products. Generally, when we think of marijuana products, we're talking about things that are edible, such as gummies or brownies, things like that. As far as home cultivation goes, Montanas are permitted up to 2 mature and 2 immature plants for their own recreational or adult use, and 4 and 4 for medicinal use. And finally, marijuana in Montana is only permitted to be consumed on private property. That's, out of public view, behind the shades, or, behind closed doors. Now, there are some caveats to a couple of these, but generally speaking, this is what marijuana use and the marijuana industry looks like in Montana. Now, as far as taxes and revenue go, at this point, I'll hand it over to Joe Bond, and he'll talk about where you can find the information you want related to taxes.
All right. Hello. I'm Joe Bond with the LFD, and I am uh, doing marijuana revenue forecasting, but I also just deal with the distributions and tax rates as well. So we have posted a few materials on the new website. So I'm going to walk you through where to find the marijuana brochure, and then I'll go over that with you today. Um, our website's going a little bit slow, so I will just show you where I would click if I were to do that. So if you go up here, you go to fiscal, and then we've got publications right here. That'll take you to this page, and if you go to the brochures tab down here, we've got marijuana tax, and that will bring you to a brochure that looks like this. So this will have all the information that you'd want on revenues and distributions from marijuana under current law. I'm not going to read directly off the page, but I will send a link with this. There will be a link available with this with the presentation. I'm just going to go over this kind of briefly. So there are basically three main ways that the state collects revenue from marijuana. There are licenses and fees, there's medical use, and then adult use. There are some fines, fees, and forfeitures as well. All of that revenue for the entire fiscal year is going to be compiled into the marijuana revenue account. So currently, for fiscal year 2025, there's about $30 million in this account, and that will approach close to $60 million. And then at the end of the fiscal year, the distributions from that account will be made. So the Department of Revenue will take out admin costs as well as a 3-month operating reserve. The first $6 million will be sent to the Heart Fund, and then the remaining distribution is based off of percentages of whatever's left. So about 32% is going to go to FWP for state parks, non-game wildlife, trail recreational facilities, and then wildlife habitat. And then 3% up to $200,000 will go to veteran affairs. And then there in statute, there is a $150,000 distribution to the Board of Crime Control. And there is an additional $300,000 that also goes to the Board of Crime Control through fiscal year 2027, pursuant to House Bill 362. I'll talk a little bit more about these distributions as well. After all of those distributions, the remaining funds are going to go to the general fund. And so last year, that was about $32 million. So here's a breakdown of what the distributions look like, as well as links to different bills. As far as the taxes and the revenues, so for adult use, there's a 20% sales tax, and for medical use, there is a 4% sales tax. The licenses and fees are a little bit convoluted, but essentially they're imposed on cultivators, manufacturers, dispensers, testing laboratories, transporters, and marijuana worker permit fees. Those licenses and fees are going to be binned and boxed based off of the size and production of the facilities. All of the links to the code and everything can be found here as well. I'd be happy to go into detail with anybody as well after. Um, Additionally, counties have the option to apply a 3% sales tax to adult use. 50% is going to be retained by the counties. 45 is going to go back to the municipalities in those counties based off the population ratios. And then DOR is reimbursed the remaining 5% for admin costs. DOR has estimates of what those local option sales tax collections are. And then finally, the civil penalties are less than $500,000 a year. So the one final thing that I want to talk about briefly for marijuana distribution is there is a tie to the GTB ratio, or the guaranteed tax base, with marijuana general fund revenue. So there's a formula in statute, but essentially, if the distribution to the general fund from the marijuana state special revenue account is greater than $1 million, it increases by more than $1 million from year to year, then there will be an impact on the GTB. And so from fiscal year 2024, we estimated that impact of the GTB was about an increase of, and the GTB ratio is very complicated, but Julia Patton in our office will be happy to go over with you. But there's about a $3.7 million general fund impact from this distribution. This distribution is found in House Bill 663 as well as MCA linked here. And that is something that we just want more legislators to be aware of, because it's not directly involved with the original bill that was passed from I-190.
Joe, can I ask, this is Russ Minor, can I ask a question?
I think that we will do questions at the end, but I'd be happy to take your question. We're just trying to get through the recording.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to hand it back to Matt now.
Okay, so to start wrapping things up here, some things to bear in mind in terms of current issues and the way forward here with marijuana as a whole. When it comes to marijuana, you could really pick and choose anything, and yeah, that could be considered an issue. So to keep things simple, to keep things kind of the higher level, we've categorized this into three main topics, two of which are kind of focused more on the federal level, but of course that's going to trickle down and affect us here in Montana. And then this last one focused more on Montana. And I'll address each one of these independently, but as it is, banking, the thing to bear in mind here is currently marijuana business is really a cash business. How will that look in the future? Rescheduling, how is a potential rescheduling going to change the landscape? Will that open the floodgates here in Montana and of course the rest of the United States? And then finally, Montana specific is the licensing moratorium. How will that pending expiration affect Montana's path ahead? So as far as banking goes, the thing to bear in mind is that federal laws basically make it virtually impossible for banks to safely do business with marijuana businesses. And that's because they could be subject to a variety of penalties for doing business. What this results in is that the marijuana business owners really are reliant on cash-only transactions. And that means there are large sums of physical cash in various locations, to include these business owners transporting large sums of cash to wherever they need to get them, be it the CCD or to their own other businesses. This makes business owners and locations prime targets for theft and robbery. So something to keep in mind with this is the Safer Banking Act here. Again, this is at the federal level. This would not legalize marijuana, but it would resolve that tension between federal and state laws in regards to how the financial field is managed. Basically, we could see a transition from something akin to the 1880s to a more modern 2020s approach to marijuana purchases, banking, lending, insuring, things like that. Again, not a guarantee, but something to keep in mind at the federal level, and how potential passage of this bill would change the financial landscape. Next is the DEA intent to reschedule. Again, not a guarantee, although it does look very likely. This would likely happen in early 2025. And what this would do is take marijuana from Schedule 1, being no medical qualities, high potential for abuse and dependence, down to Schedule 3. Basically saying that there are some medicinal qualities, but requires a prescription. How would this change the marijuana landscape? Well, anything on this schedule still requires a prescription in order to be used. And in order to be eligible for prescriptions, the FDA still needs to approve its medicinal use. And even if that were to happen, it would still be subject to regulation under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The point here being, if this happens, as it looks very likely to, it doesn't mean that things would change overnight, and it would still be a medicinal only program. Recreational marijuana would still remain illegal in terms of rescheduling. One other thing to kind of keep in mind with rescheduling is how that might change interstate commerce. Be aware that California, Oregon, and Washington have their own interstate commerce laws that would allow their marijuana businesses to transport marijuana products or THC products interstate to other regulated markets. Of course, that's only if the federal government were to legalize marijuana or interstate commerce. But again, just be aware that other states are already forward thinking about how they could get in on any potential interstate commerce related to rescheduling. And then finally, Montana specific. From the very beginning, Montana had a moratorium on licensing, and that allowed only prior existing medical marijuana licensees to join the recreational market. So what we see here in Montana is all businesses that already existed as medical marijuana businesses prior to 2022. Originally, that was going to expire in June of 2023, but that was extended to June 2025, specifically June 30th, 2025. So the thing to bear in mind with this is if and when that expires, how Montana's licensing will be open to a variety of new applicants, not the ones that have already existed in Montana prior to, and how that landscape could change. Related, although not directly, but still related, is the footprint that number one does exist and then could exist with the new applications. And that is that Montana is home to over 400 licensed dispensaries. Keeping this in mind, Montana, specifically, if we look at like a place like Missoula, there's one of the highest ratios of dispensaries to population. And with this in mind, Missoula, of all places, decided to implement a 2-year moratorium on its new dispensary licenses because of the proliferation of marijuana business, even within a city that was very welcoming of this change. So the thing to keep in mind with footprint is there is no Montana statute that limits the size of the total footprint, although there are limits on where these premises can be. And the local municipalities are able to implement their own additional ordinances. But in general, a Montana statute does not permit premises within 500 feet of churches, schools, and childcare facilities. There are some nuances, but again, that's kind of the footprint thing to consider. What does Montana's marijuana footprint look like just in general, but then also as we look to the short and midterm future? And that's really the big question is, with these things in mind here, licensing in Montana in general, but then also potential changes in terms of rescheduling and banking, what would Montana's marijuana market short and midterm future look like? So with all this in mind, here are a few references. If you got any questions specific to statute, you'll find that in Title 16, Chapter 12. This is just a collection of some links that might give a little bit more information on certain aspects related to marijuana as a whole. This will all be available in the slide that's provided later on. No need to copy any of this down right away. But again, the big thing I want you to take away from here is Title 16, Chapter 12 is what you want to know about marijuana regulation and taxation. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions you might have for myself or Joe, and thank you for your time.